The patrol came back with 5 men instead of 8, and the silence they carried was worse than any scream. Lieutenant Morris stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them emerge from the green wall of jungle, their faces blank as washed stone, and he knew, before anyone spoke, that something had broken inside them. If this topic resonates with you, subscribe and support the episode. The missing men weren't listed as killed in action, not yet. Morris had seen enough of New Guinea to know the difference between a fight and a vanishing. A fight left evidence, brass casings scattered in the mud, blood on the ferns, the sharp chemical smell of cordite hanging in the wet air. This patrol had fired nothing. They'd simply walked into the jungle near Salamaua, and 3 men had stopped existing. The other 5 looked like they'd aged a decade in the 6 hours they'd been gone, their uniforms dark with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. Private Dennison was the one who finally talked, 2 hours later, after the medical officer had checked him for fever and found nothing but a pulse that wouldn't slow down. He sat on an ammunition crate outside the command tent, hands shaking so badly he couldn't light his cigarette. Morris lit it for him and waited. The jungle around them buzzed and clicked with the 1,000 invisible things that made New Guinea feel like the Earth's green throat. Somewhere in the distance, a bird made a sound like rusty hinges. Dennison stared at nothing, smoke curling past his eyes. "Quote 0, Dennison said. His voice came out thin, stretched tight over something that wanted to break through. "Quote 1. Dennison drew on the cigarette, the ember flaring bright enough to show the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Quote 2. The bullet had come from somewhere in the canopy, Dennison said, though none of them had seen muzzle flash or heard the shot clearly. Just a wet sound, and Mackay folding at the knees, his canteen swinging on its strap, water still sloshing inside it as he hit the ground. They'd frozen then, every man trying to become stone, and that's when Dennison heard it too. The soft, rhythmic slosh of water in metal containers. 8 canteens moving in 8 different patterns as their owners breathed. Like a signature. Like a beacon pulsing in the green darkness. Quote 3, Dennison continued. Quote 4. He looked at Morris with eyes that had seen something fundamental break in the order of things. Quote 5. The remaining men had scattered then, abandoning formation, abandoning doctrine, abandoning everything except the animal need to survive. Dennison had run until his lungs burned, until the jungle opened onto a creek bed where he'd thrown himself into the water and stayed submerged until his vision started to tunnel. When he came up, gasping, he found 3 others already there. They'd waited an hour before moving again, and this time they dumped their canteens in the mud. Morris reported it up the chain that evening, typing the incident on thin paper that curled in the humidity. He used careful language, possible sniper activity, patrol compromised, recommend increased vigilance. He did not write that a Japanese marksman might be tracking men by the noise of their canteens because it sounded like something from a ghost story, and ghost stories didn't belong in official reports. The response came back 3 days later, stamped and signed by someone in Moresby who'd probably never left the coast. Patrol leader to receive additional training in noise discipline. Incident attributed to combat stress. The words combat stress were underlined twice, as if emphasis could make the problem disappear. But 5 days after that, another patrol went out near the same area. Different unit, different men, same green maze of trees and vines, where the light came down in shafts like pillars in a flooded cathedral. They were mapping suspected supply routes, moving slow and quiet, experienced men who knew how to step without snapping branches. 6 went in. 4 came back. The survivors reported the same thing. No visual contact, no return fire possible. Just the clean, surgical removal of 2 men who'd made the mistake of carrying standard-issue canteens filled to regulation capacity. One of them had been shot through the lower back, right where the canteen rode on his hip. That's when Captain Hewitt started paying attention. He was signals, not infantry. A thin man with a Brisbane accent and hands that were always busy with wire or solder or some piece of equipment he'd taken apart to understand. His younger brother David was in one of the rifle companies, 20 years old, and writing letters home about how the jungle wasn't as bad as everyone said, how he'd be back for Christmas. Hewitt hadn't seen him in 2 months, but they were stationed close enough that he could have walked to David's position in an afternoon. He kept meaning to make the trip. The telegram arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a corporal who wouldn't meet Hewitt's eyes. David had been killed 3 days earlier during a routine patrol near the Markham Valley. Single shot, lower torso, bled out before they could get him to an aid station. The official cause of death would read _7_, which told Hewitt nothing except that his brother had been alive and then wasn't. He found the patrol leader that afternoon, a sergeant named Vickers, who had the look of a man who'd stopped sleeping properly. Vickers was cleaning his rifle outside the mess tent, with movements so repetitive they'd become a kind of meditation. When Hewitt asked about David, Vickers kept working the cloth through the barrel, in and out, not looking up. "Your brother was a good soldier," Vickers said, which was what everyone said about the dead. "Followed orders, kept his head down. We were just moving through a clearing, standard sweep. Thought the area was secure." He paused, the cloth going still. He'd stopped to take a drink, had his canteen up to his mouth when it happened. The shot came from somewhere high, maybe 50 yards out. We never saw the shooter. Hewitt felt something cold settle in his chest. The canteen was full? Vickers looked at him then, really looked, and Hewitt saw recognition there. "You've heard the stories," Vickers said. It wasn't a question. Quote 13. He went back to cleaning the rifle. Quote 14. That night, Hewitt couldn't sleep. He lay in his cot, listening to the camp settle into its nervous nocturnal rhythm. Sentries changing position, someone coughing in the next tent, the distant crack of a tree falling somewhere in the darkness. He kept seeing David's last letter, the one that had arrived 2 weeks ago, cheerful and ordinary and full of complaints about the food. His brother had been 20 years old and still thought the universe operated on fair principles. At 0300 hours, Hewitt gave up on sleep and walked to the supply depot. The private on guard duty was smoking and didn't ask questions when Hewitt signed out a requisition form for miscellaneous signals equipment. Inside, Hewitt found what he was looking for, a standard-issue canteen, the kind every man in the theater carried. He filled it halfway with water and shook it. The sound was unmistakable, a liquid rattle that seemed louder in the quiet of the tent. He shook it again, harder. Metal and water, creating a rhythm that could carry 30 yards easy, maybe more in the right conditions. He spent the rest of the night in the signals tent, wrapping the canteen in everything he could find. First, he tried canvas, cutting strips from an old equipment bag and binding them tight with wire. When he shook the canteen, the sound was muffled, but still there, still detectable. He unwrapped it and tried rubber, salvaging pieces from a damaged rain poncho. Better, but not good enough. The water still made itself known, a softer slosh that would give a patient hunter all the information he needed. By dawn, he'd gone through felt, leather, layers of burlap, even the cotton batting from a first aid kit. Nothing eliminated the sound completely. He could reduce it, dampen it, change its character, but the fundamental problem remained. Water in a metal container wanted to announce itself. Physics didn't care about survival. Lieutenant Morris found him at 0600, surrounded by strips of fabric and wire and 3 canteens in various states of wrapping. Morris stood in the doorway of the tent, taking in the scene with an expression Hewitt couldn't quite read. Quote 15, Morris said carefully. Quote 16. Hewitt held up the latest attempt, a canteen wrapped so thickly in layered burlap it looked like a fabric tumor. Quote 17. Morris was quiet for a moment. Morris stepped into the tent, letting the flap close behind him. Hewitt shook the wrapped canteen. The sound was muffled, turned into a dull thud instead of a slosh, but still audible. Quote 23. Morris picked up one of the failed attempts, a canteen wrapped in alternating layers of rubber and canvas. He turned it over in his hands, examining Hewitt's work with the attention of a man who understood that wars were won or lost on details nobody thought to write down in the manuals. "The supply sergeant is going to file a complaint," Morris said. "Destruction of military property, unauthorized use of materiel, the whole parade. Could mean a formal reprimand, maybe worse if someone up the chain decides to make an example." He set the canteen down. "On the other hand, I've got 3 patrols scheduled for tomorrow, and I'd rather they came back intact. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and studied Hewitt through the smoke. You've got 24 hours before I have to acknowledge that complaint officially. After that, I can't protect you. So whatever you're trying to do here, either make it work or make it disappear. Hewitt was still testing materials when the Papuan scout found him. The man appeared without sound sometime around noon, materializing at the edge of the tent the way the local guides did, as if the jungle had simply exhaled him into existence. His name was Kila, and he worked as a tracker for the Australian forces, one of the dozens of New Guinea natives who knew the terrain better than any map. Kila watched Hewitt shake another wrapped canteen, this one bound in strips of tire rubber salvaged from a wrecked supply truck. The sound was better than the burlap, but still not silent, still not invisible to an ear trained to listen. Hewitt caught the expression on Kila's face, something between amusement and pity, the look of someone watching a child try to solve a problem the hard way. Quote 28, Kila asked. His English carried the cadence of Tok Pisin underneath it, each word carefully selected. He pointed at the pile of failed experiments. Quote 29. He paused, searching for the word, then gave up and gestured toward the jungle. Quote 30. Hewitt followed him out of the camp and into the tree line, past the sentries and into the green cathedral where the air turned thick and wet. Kila moved through the undergrowth like water, finding paths that weren't visible until he showed them, and Hewitt struggled to keep up, branches catching at his uniform, vines trying to trip him. They walked for maybe 20 minutes, though time felt different under the canopy, stretched and compressed at the same time. Kila stopped at a massive tree that rose like a pillar into the upper canopy, its trunk wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. The bark was pale gray, almost white in places, and something about it looked wrong to Hewitt's eye, lumpy and irregular. Kila pulled out a knife and cut into the bark, peeling back a section to reveal pale fibers underneath, wispy and cotton-like. Quote 31. Kila said, pulling out a handful of the stuff. It was impossibly light, floating on the air when he released it. Quote 32. He took Hewitt's wrapped canteen and began unwinding the rubber strips. Your metal and hard things, they hold sound. This absorbs, like water going into sand. He worked quickly, wrapping the canteen in layers of kapok fiber, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The first layer he packed tight against the metal, pressing it into every contour. The second layer he applied more loosely, creating a buffer of air and fiber. He secured it all with what looked like vine, though Hewitt suspected it was actually stripped bark that Kila had prepared somehow. When he finished, the canteen looked like it had grown a pale tumor, bulbous and organic. Kila filled it from his own water supply, shook it hard, and handed it to Hewitt. The sound was barely a whisper, a soft rustle that could have been wind in leaves or the settling of undergrowth. Hewitt shook it again, harder. The sound didn't increase, didn't sharpen. It just remained at that same barely there level, absorbed into the fiber. Quote 34, Kila said, and Hewitt felt his chest tighten. Quote 35. He gestured at the canteen. Quote 36. They returned to camp with enough kapok to wrap a dozen canteens, Kila carrying it in a woven bag that seemed to hold an impossible amount. But when they reached the supply depot, they found Sergeant Holbrook waiting, a clipboard in his hand and an expression that said he'd been rehearsing this conversation. Captain Hewitt, Holbrook said, his voice carrying the formal tone of a man creating a paper trail. I need to discuss the unauthorized requisition of military supplies from my depot. Canvas, rubber, wire, and various other materials totaling approximately, he consulted his clipboard, 47 pounds of usable goods. This is in direct violation of supply protocols and represents a significant irregularity in my inventory. Hewitt started to respond, but Holbrook held up a hand. I've already filed the initial complaint with Lieutenant Morris, as is my duty. However, I've been informed that you have 24 hours to either return the materials or provide adequate justification for their use. That deadline expires, he checked his watch, in approximately 6 hours. Behind Holbrook, Hewitt could see other soldiers watching, drawn by the smell of official trouble. Word traveled fast in camps like this, and already he could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked like they were measuring him for the court-martial that might be coming. "I can justify it," Hewitt said, holding up the kapok-wrapped canteen. "This is a solution to a tactical problem that's cost us at least 15 men in the last 2 weeks." Holbrook's expression didn't change. "Then I suggest you prepare a demonstration for Lieutenant Morris. A convincing one." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Captain, my nephew was in that first patrol that came back short. So I'm hoping whatever you've got there works. But hoping doesn't change regulations." After he left, Kila set down the bag of kapok and looked at Hewitt with something like concern. "You have enemy here too," he said, gesturing around the camp. "Not just in jungle. This thing you want to do, it makes some men nervous. Change makes nervous." Hewitt spent the next 3 hours wrapping canteens, working with a kind of focused intensity that shut out everything else. Kila taught him the technique. Tight inner layer, loose outer layer, secured with wire since they didn't have enough vine. The kapok came from several sources now. Kila had sent word to other scouts, and they'd started appearing with bags of the fiber, silent offerings that suggested a network of communication Hewitt hadn't known existed. By the time Morris returned, Hewitt had prepared 8 canteens, each one wrapped according to Kila's specifications. Morris examined them, shook them, listened. His face gave away nothing. "You've got a demonstration ready?" Morris asked. "Better," Hewitt said. "I've got a test that'll prove it works or doesn't, but I need a volunteer, someone the men trust, and I need that Japanese POW from the interrogation compound, the one who used to be a marksman." Morris went very still. "You want to put a prisoner and a loaded weapon in the same space?" "No weapon," Hewitt said. "Just ears. If this works, he won't need to see to know which canteen is wrapped and which isn't. And if it doesn't work..." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what failure would mean. Morris spent the next morning arguing with Major Carson about the demonstration, and Hewitt could hear their voices through the canvas walls of the command tent even from 30 yards away. Carson's position was clear and loud. Using a Japanese prisoner for anything beyond intelligence gathering violated about 6 different regulations. And if something went wrong, it would be Morris's career in a box, being shipped back to Brisbane. Morris's counter-argument was quieter but more persistent. 15 men in 2 weeks. Maybe more if you counted the ones who died from wounds sustained in similar circumstances. At some point, the regulations had to bend around the reality of what was happening in the jungle, or there wouldn't be anyone left to regulate. By noon, Carson had given conditional approval, with so many caveats attached that the permission barely resembled permission at all. The prisoner would be blindfolded and restrained. No fewer than 4 armed guards would be present. The demonstration would take place in a controlled area with limited access. And if anything went wrong, Morris would be explaining it to a board of inquiry before the week was out. The prisoner's name was Takeda, according to the interrogation reports, though Hewitt suspected that might not be his real name. He'd been captured 3 weeks earlier after his unit was overrun near Leh, and he'd proven cooperative in an unusual way. Not eager to betray his country, but willing to answer technical questions about tactics and equipment with the careful precision of someone who'd stopped believing in the cause, but couldn't quite abandon the craft. Takeda was a small man, shorter than most of the Australian soldiers, with hands that showed the calluses of someone who'd spent years holding a rifle. When they brought him to the clearing Hewitt had selected, Takeda's eyes tracked everything with the attention of a professional observer. He noticed the wrapped canteens arranged on a table. He noticed Kila standing at the edge of the clearing. He noticed the tension in the way the guards held their rifles. Through the interpreter, a nervous corporal named Chen, who spoke Japanese learned from his grandmother in Sydney, Hewitt explained what he wanted. Takeda would be blindfolded and positioned in the center of the clearing. 2 men would walk past at varying distances, one with a standard canteen, one with a kapok-wrapped version. Takeda would indicate which direction each man was walking, based solely on sound. Takeda listened to the translation, then spoke for nearly a minute, his words careful and deliberate. Chen translated. Quote, 54. Hewitt hadn't expected philosophy. He looked at Takeda, really looked at him, and saw someone wrestling with the same questions Hewitt had been avoiding. Tell him, Hewitt said slowly, that his people are already using this technique. They've been hunting us by sound for weeks. I'm just trying to even the odds. And tell him that if positions were reversed, his officers would do the same thing without asking his permission. Chen translated. Takeda considered this, then nodded once. He said something short, almost clipped. Chen hesitated before translating. He says his officers sent him to die in a jungle for reasons he stopped understanding months ago. He would rather contribute to something practical than rot in a prison cage waiting for a war to end. They blindfolded Takeda with a strip of dark cloth, checking twice to ensure he couldn't see. The guards positioned themselves at the cardinal points around him, rifles ready but not quite aimed. Hewitt had chosen 2 volunteers for the walking test, Private Yates, who carried a standard canteen, and Corporal Brennan, who carried one of Hewitt's wrapped versions. The first pass was simple. Yates walked from north to south, 20 feet from Takeda, moving at a normal patrol pace. His canteen was 3/4 full, and even Hewitt could hear the distinctive slosh from where he stood. Takeda's head turned immediately, tracking the sound with the precision of a radar dish. When Yates had passed, Takeda pointed in the exact direction he'd gone and spoke a single word. Chen didn't need to translate. The meaning was clear. Brennan went next, walking the same path, same distance, same pace. His wrapped canteen made almost no sound, just the soft rustle that could have been clothing or equipment or the wind in the trees. Takeda's head moved, searching, but the tracking was uncertain. He pointed, but the gesture was vague, off by at least 15 degrees. They ran it again, varying the distances and directions. Standard canteen at 40 feet, wrapped canteen at 15 feet, standard at 30, wrapped at 25. Every time, Takeda found the unwrapped canteen with mechanical accuracy. Every time, he struggled with the wrapped version, his head moving back and forth like someone trying to locate a whisper in a crowded room. Major Carson had been watching from the edge of the clearing, his face giving away nothing. Now he stepped forward and spoke directly to Takeda, not waiting for translation. Again, he said, but this time both men walk simultaneously, opposite directions. It was a harder test, designed to see if Takeda could differentiate when the sounds overlapped. Yates and Brennan walked their paths, crossing each other's trajectory. Takeda's head snapped toward Yates immediately, following the standard canteen with complete confidence. He gestured vaguely in Brennan's direction, but clearly had no precise fix on him. Carson watched this, his jaw working. Then he turned to Sergeant Holbrook, who'd been standing behind him with that same unreadable expression. How many canteens can we wrap with available materials? Holbrook consulted his clipboard. If we're talking about materials currently in inventory and not allocated to other purposes, maybe 30 or 40. If Captain Hewitt wants more than that, he'll need formal authorization to redirect supplies. And if he gets that authorization, Carson said, how long before we can equip an entire company? The question hung in the air like humidity. Holbrook looked at Hewitt, at the wrapped canteens on the table, at Kila standing quietly with his bag of kapok. The wrapping takes time if it's done right. Maybe 10 minutes per canteen for someone who knows what they're doing, longer for someone learning. You want 100 men equipped properly? You're looking at days of work, maybe a week. Carson nodded slowly, then did something Hewitt hadn't expected. He walked over to Takeda and removed the blindfold himself. Takeda blinked in the sudden light, his eyes adjusting, and Carson looked at him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been something more complicated. Through Chen, Carson said, quote 65. Takeda listened to the translation, then responded. Chen's voice was quiet. He says he understands that war makes philosophers of everyone, even men who just want to go home. He asks if he can return to his cell now. After they'd taken Takeda away, Hewitt stood in the clearing watching the shadows lengthen. Morris approached, lighting a cigarette and offering one to Hewitt, who took it even though he barely smoked. Quote 67, Morris said. Quote 68. Hewitt drew on the cigarette, tasting ash and uncertainty. Quote 69. Morris smiled, but there was no humor in it. Quote 70. The work began that same evening, in a clearing 200 yards from the main camp, far enough that it wouldn't attract casual attention, but close enough that guards could maintain a perimeter. Hewitt set up 3 workstations, using salvaged crates and ammunition boxes as tables. The kapok arrived in batches, brought by Papuan scouts who appeared at irregular intervals with bags of the pale fiber, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions about where they were getting it. Kila supervised the first training session, teaching 4 soldiers the wrapping technique, with the patience of someone who understood that speed would come later, after the hands learned what they were doing. The soldiers were volunteers, men who'd either lost friends to the jungle snipers or had been on patrols that came back short. Private Chen was there, his translation skills no longer needed, but his hands proving surprisingly deft at the delicate work. Corporal Brennan joined, already familiar with the wrapped canteen from the demonstration. The other 2 were riflemen from different companies, their presence evidence that word was spreading faster than Morris had anticipated. The technique looked simple, but required attention. Inner layer compressed tight against the metal, eliminating air pockets where sound could resonate. Outer layer loose and thick, creating a buffer zone that absorbed vibration. Wire wrapped in a spiral pattern to secure everything without creating pressure points that might compress the kapok unevenly. Each canteen took between 8 and 12 minutes if done properly. Longer if someone rushed and had to start over. By midnight, they'd completed 19 canteens. The men worked in near silence, focused on the rhythm of wrap and secure, wrap and secure. Hewitt tested each one personally, filling it with water and shaking it hard, listening for the telltale slosh that would mean failure. Most passed. 3 had to be unwrapped and redone, the kapok redistributed more evenly. Private Yates showed up around 0100 hours, with 5 men from his platoon, all of them looking half guilty and half determined. "Heard you were running a workshop," Yates said, not quite meeting Hewitt's eyes. Hewitt understood what wasn't being said. These men wanted canteens wrapped, but didn't want to wait for official channels that might not exist. They wanted the knowledge itself, insurance they could carry with them. He gestured to the workstations. Quote 73. The clearing became a kind of makeshift factory. Men rotating through in shifts, some learning the technique while others worked on their own canteens. Someone had liberated a few storm lanterns from the supply depot, and their yellow light turned the workspace into an island of activity in the darkness. The guards on perimeter changed twice, but the work continued, taking on a momentum of its own. Sergeant Holbrook arrived around 0300, picking his way through the clearing with a flashlight and that same clipboard that seemed permanently attached to his hand. He stood watching the operation for several minutes, his face unreadable. Then he approached Hewitt, who was helping Chen rewrap a canteen that had developed a sound-producing gap in the kapok. _quote_74_Holbrook said, gesturing at the 24 men now working in the clearing. Quote 75. Hewitt set down the canteen and stood. Quote 76. Quote 77. Holbrook flipped through his clipboard. Quote 78. Behind him, the work had stopped. The men watched the confrontation with the careful attention of soldiers who understood that their survival might depend on how this conversation ended. Kila continued wrapping a canteen, his movements unhurried, as if bureaucratic disputes were weather patterns that would pass eventually. Hewitt chose his words carefully. Quote 79. He paused. Quote 80. Holbrook stared at him for a long moment. Then he closed the clipboard with a snap that sounded like a decision being made. Quote 81, he said. Quote 82. He turned to leave, then stopped. Quote 83. The work continued through the night and into the next day. Men came and went, some learning the technique, others just watching to see if this was real or another piece of camp mythology that would evaporate under scrutiny. By dawn, the clearing looked like the aftermath of a strange battle, littered with wire scraps and loose kapok fibers and empty water cans. Lieutenant Morris appeared during the morning shift change, bringing coffee and canteen cups that he distributed to the workers. He examined several completed canteens, shaking them, weighing them in his hands. "Quote 84, he asked. "Quote 85, Hewitt said. "Quote 86. Morris nodded slowly. "Quote 87. "Quote 88, Hewitt said. "Quote 89. "Quote 90, Morris finished. "Quote 91. He set down his coffee. "Quote 92. The afternoon heat turned the jungle into a steam bath, and the two patrols disappeared into the green wall with their wrapped canteens and their standard weapons, and their hope that Hewitt's obsession might be something more than grief dressed up as engineering. Hewitt watched them go, counting men, memorizing faces, doing the mental arithmetic of survival that had become automatic. Kila stood beside him, also watching. "In my village," Kila said, "we have story about man who tried to make silence. He worked and worked, trying to stop all sound, make everything quiet. Finally succeeded. Then realized silence was death, because living things make noise. Sound means alive." Hewitt didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about David's last letter, about the casual way his brother had complained about the food and the heat and the boredom of patrol duty, never imagining that the water in his canteen would be the last sound he'd make. "Quote 95, Hewitt finally said. "Quote 96. Kila considered this. "Quote 97. The patrols were due back by nightfall, but nightfall came and went with no sign of them. This wasn't unusual. Patrol schedules were guidelines, not guarantees. But Hewitt found himself pacing the perimeter, smoking cigarettes he'd borrowed from Chen, watching the jungle edge for movement that didn't come. Morris found him there, around 2200 hours. "They're not overdue yet," Morris said. "Could be they found something worth investigating, or they're moving slower than planned, or 100 other things that don't involve casualties. Or they could be dead because we gave them equipment we'd tested exactly once, in a controlled environment, with a cooperative subject who had no reason to actually hunt anyone." Hewitt's voice came out harsher than he'd intended. "We don't know if kapok works when someone's actually trying to kill you. We don't know if it holds up in rain, or if movement degrades it, or if—" "Captain," Morris's voice cut through the spiral. Quote 103. The first patrol returned at 02:30 hours, all 8 men intact. They came through the perimeter checkpoint muddy and exhausted, but alive, and Hewitt felt something in his chest unclench slightly. The patrol leader, a corporal named Davies, reported to Morris while the others headed for the mess tent and whatever food might still be available at this hour. Hewitt waited until the debriefing was done, then caught Davies before he could disappear. Quote 104, Hewitt said. Quote 105. Davies looked at him with eyes that had gone flat from too many hours of hypervigilance. Quote 106. He paused, pulling his own canteen from his belt. It was wrapped in kapok that had turned dark with moisture and dirt, the pale fibers matted and stained. Quote 107. He handed it to Hewitt, who shook it. The sound was marginally louder than when it had been dry, but still nothing like an unwrapped canteen. The kapok had absorbed water without losing its sound-dampening properties completely, which was more than Hewitt had dared hope for. Quote 108, Hewitt asked. Quote 109. Davies reclaimed his canteen. Quote 110. The second patrol came in 3 hours later, just before dawn. 7 men, not 8. They moved with the careful deliberation of people who'd seen something break in the world's surface and were trying not to look directly at the crack. Hewitt's stomach dropped as he counted them, the arithmetic of loss already calculating in his head. Morris met them at the checkpoint, and Hewitt stood far enough back to be unobtrusive, but close enough to hear. The patrol leader was Sergeant Vickers, the same man who'd been with David when he died. Vickers's uniform was torn across one shoulder, and there was dried blood on his forearm that didn't look like his own. Quote 11, Vickers said, his voice stripped of inflection. He looked past Morris to where Hewitt stood. Morris dismissed the patrol and walked over to Hewitt. He said quietly. Hewitt nodded, but the guilt settled in his chest anyway, irrational and heavy. He'd been so focused on the acoustic problem that he'd half forgotten mines, ambushes, disease, artillery, and the 1,000 other ways the jungle killed men. The canteen wrapping couldn't save everyone. It could only address one specific failure mode in a system designed to produce casualties. Word about the patrols spread through the camp like water finding cracks. By noon, Hewitt had a line of men outside the clearing where the wrapping operation had set up more permanently. They came with their canteens and whatever materials they'd scrounged, strips of cloth, pieces of rubber, wire salvaged from broken equipment. Most had no kapok because the supply was still limited, controlled by Kila and his network of scouts who appeared and disappeared according to rhythms Hewitt didn't understand. Some men offered trades, cigarettes, chocolate rations, even money, though money meant nothing out here. Hewitt turned them away, explaining that without proper materials the wrapping would be ineffective, possibly even dangerous if it gave false confidence. But the men kept coming anyway, hoping that somehow the rules would bend for them. Private Chen organized a waiting list, writing names in a notebook with the methodical care of someone creating an official record that wasn't official at all. By evening, the list had 43 names on it, representing men from 6 different companies. Chen showed it to Hewitt with something like concern. Quote, 116, Chen said. Quote, 117. Hewitt studied the names, recognizing some from previous patrols or shared mess shifts. Each name represented someone who'd decided that the canteen problem was real enough to warrant action, even unofficial action that might mean nothing tomorrow. How many names if we limit it to men actually going on patrol in the next week? Chen did the math. Maybe 15, 20? Manageable if we prioritize. But that means telling the others no, and I don't know if you've noticed, but men who think they might die soon don't take kindly to being told to wait their turn. The decision was taken out of Hewitt's hands that afternoon when Major Carson appeared in the clearing with 2 men Hewitt didn't recognize. They wore the insignia of Quartermaster Corps, but carried themselves with the bureaucratic weight of people whose real authority came from somewhere higher up the chain. Carson's face was carefully neutral as he made introductions. Reynolds was a thick man with the pale skin of someone who spent his war behind desks. He examined the wrapping operation with visible distaste, picking up a finished canteen and turning it over as if it might be hiding contraband. Quote 121. His tone made it clear what he thought of that. Quote 122. Hewitt said, keeping his voice level. Quote 123. Quote 124. Reynolds set down the canteen. Quote 125. Marsh, younger and quieter, had been examining Chen's notebook. You've got 43 men requesting this service. That's nearly company strength. At what point were you planning to formalize this program and request actual authorization? Authorization was granted by Major Carson for a limited trial, Hewitt said, looking at Carson, who gave the smallest shake of his head. The message was clear. Carson had given tacit approval, nothing more, and now that approval was evaporating under scrutiny from higher levels. Reynolds walked the perimeter of the clearing, taking in the workstations, the stored kapok, the half-wrapped canteens waiting for completion. As of now, this operation is suspended pending review. All materials are to be inventoried and returned to proper supply channels. All wrapped canteens currently in circulation are to be collected and evaluated for compliance with equipment standards. He turned to Carson. Major, I'll need a full accounting of how this project was initiated and what authorizations were claimed. Carson's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Quote 130. After Reynolds and Marsh left, the clearing emptied quickly. The men who'd been learning the wrapping techniques scattered like smoke, taking their knowledge with them. Chen closed his notebook and slipped it into his pocket, the list of names suddenly contraband. Kila simply disappeared into the jungle without a word, taking his bag of kapok with him. Hewitt stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the evidence of 3 days' work: wire scraps, loose fibers, the smell of canvas and rubber and sweat. Morris approached, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. Quote 131, Morris said. Quote 132. Quote 133. Hewitt heard the anger in his own voice. Quote 134. Quote 135, Morris said. Quote 136. He dropped the cigarette and ground it out. Quote 137. The official shutdown lasted exactly 4 days. During that time, Hewitt returned to his regular signals duties, repairing field telephones and maintaining radio equipment as if the clearing had never existed. He didn't speak about the canteens, didn't acknowledge the men who caught his eye in the mess tent with looks that asked questions he couldn't answer. Reynolds and Marsh conducted their inventory, counted materials, wrote reports that would circulate through channels Hewitt would never see. But the rapping didn't stop. It just moved underground, became something that happened in the spaces between official activities. Hewitt would find men working on canteens behind the latrine trenches at odd hours, or see groups huddled in tents after lights out with storm lamps turned low. The technique spread through demonstration and whispered instruction, passed along like contraband knowledge. Kila never returned to the camp officially, but kapok kept appearing anyway. Small bundles would turn up near the perimeter, left by unseen hands. Sometimes it arrived wrapped in banana leaves, other times in woven bags that smelled of smoke and earth. The Papuan scouts had their own networks, their own reasons for wanting Australian soldiers to survive, and those networks operated according to rules that had nothing to do with military supply chains. Private Chen became a broker of sorts, though he never acknowledged the role explicitly. Men would approach him with requests for materials or instruction, and somehow those requests would be fulfilled through channels that left no paper trail. Chen kept his notebook, but the names in it now appeared in a personal code that only he understood. Insurance against the day someone official might demand to see it. On the 5th day after the shutdown, Sergeant Vickers came back from a patrol with all 12 men intact. This wouldn't have been remarkable, except that they'd operated in the same sector where 3 previous patrols had taken casualties. Vickers reported no enemy contact, no suspicious activity, just a routine sweep that accomplished its objectives and returned on schedule. Hewitt happened to be in the command tent when Vickers filed his report, ostensibly there to repair a malfunctioning field telephone. He watched Morris read through the patrol details, seeing the calculations happening behind the lieutenant's eyes. Morris asked one question. Equipment status? All functioning normally, Vickers said, which was the standard answer. But he caught Hewitt's eye for just a moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words. After Vickers left, Morris set down the report and looked at Hewitt. I'm not asking questions I don't want answers to, but I'm noting that casualty rates in certain patrol sectors have dropped by approximately 60% in the last week. Could be random variance. Could be the enemy shifted positions. Could be a lot of things. Could be, Hewitt agreed, returning to his work on the telephone. The whisper network grew more sophisticated. Men started identifying each other through subtle signals, a particular way of wearing a canteen, a certain type of wire wrap, small markers that meant, I know what you know. It became a kind of secret society within the military structure, operating parallel to official doctrine without directly contradicting it. Then the story started changing. Hewitt first heard it from Private Yates, who'd been on one of the original test patrols. Yates was telling new recruits about jungle survival, and the canteen technique came up almost casually, as if it were standard field wisdom that everyone already knew. Quote, 143, Yates was saying. Quote, 144. Hewitt listened to this revision of history with fascination. In Yates's telling, there was no Hewitt, no official confrontation, no shutdown. Just practical knowledge that had always existed, passed down through experience. The truth was being smoothed away, replaced with a version that didn't threaten anyone or require uncomfortable questions. Other men picked up the narrative and elaborated on it. Some claimed they'd learned the technique from scouts in other sectors. Others said it was common practice in different units, imported from troops who'd been fighting longer. A few even suggested it had been in field manuals all along, just in sections nobody bothered reading. The lies bothered Hewitt at first. David had died, and Hewitt's obsessive work had led to something real, and now that reality was being dissolved into collective mythology. But Morris pointed out the advantage during one of their careful conversations that never quite acknowledged what they were discussing. "If it's always been common knowledge," Morris said, "then nobody can shut it down without admitting they didn't know what their own men were doing, and nobody can claim credit for it, which means nobody has to take responsibility if something goes wrong. The technique survives by being nobody's in particular." Reynolds and Marsh finished their investigation and left without fanfare. Their report, whatever it contained, circulated somewhere in the administrative machinery and produced no visible consequences. Hewitt was never called to account. The materials that had been inventoried were officially returned to supply, though somehow many of those materials continued appearing in the hands of men who needed them. Major Carson never spoke to Hewitt directly about the canteens again, but his patrol assignments began showing patterns. Units with higher proportions of wrapped canteens got tasked with the more dangerous reconnaissance missions, as if Carson were running an ongoing experiment without ever acknowledging it existed. The casualty rates from those missions stayed notably lower than comparable operations, though the official reports attributed this to improved patrol discipline and better intelligence. 3 weeks after the shutdown, a new batch of replacements arrived from training camps in Australia. Young men who'd never seen jungle combat, still believing in clear rules and proper procedures. They were issued standard equipment, including unwrapped canteens, and within days, the veterans were taking them aside for quiet instruction sessions that officially weren't happening. Hewitt watched this process from a distance, seeing his improvised solution become absorbed into the informal culture of survival. He'd wanted recognition, wanted David's death to mean something concrete and documented. Instead, he got erasure and myth-making, the transformation of specific grief into general practice. Private Chen found him one evening, sitting outside the signals tent and watching the jungle edge turn purple in the fading light. Chen had his notebook out, though he kept it angled so Hewitt couldn't see the current entries. Chen said, Hewitt said, quote, 150. Chen closed the notebook. Quote, 151. Hewitt felt something twist in his chest, pride and resentment mixed together. Quote, 152. Quote, 153. Chen agreed. Quote, 154. That night, Hewitt dreamed of David, not as he'd been in death, but as he'd been at 18, before the war, complaining about their father's insurance business and talking about maybe becoming an engineer. In the dream, David was wrapping something carefully, concentrating on getting the technique right, but Hewitt couldn't see what it was. When he woke, he couldn't remember if they'd spoken to each other or just worked in silence. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A war correspondent had arrived in camp, sent by military public relations to write uplifting stories about Australian ingenuity in the jungle. His name was Fletcher, and he had the eager energy of someone who still thought war was material for heroic narratives, rather than a grinding engine that processed men into casualties. Morris found Hewitt at breakfast. Hewitt set down his coffee. Morris lowered his voice. Fletcher found Hewitt in the signals tent, arriving with a notebook and the kind of enthusiasm that made experienced soldiers instinctively cautious. He was young for a war correspondent, maybe 30, with clean hands that showed he'd spent more time with typewriters than weapons. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and launched immediately into questions about field innovations and Australian resourcefulness. Hewitt gave him the sanitized version, describing minor improvements to radio equipment and techniques for keeping electronics functional in humid conditions. Fletcher nodded along, scribbling notes, but his eyes kept drifting to the canteen on Hewitt's belt. It was wrapped in kapok, the pale fibers now stained dark with use, impossible to miss if you knew what you were looking at. Quote 159, Fletcher said, pointing. Quote 160. Hewitt chose his words carefully. Quote 161. Quote 162. Fletcher reached for the canteen before Hewitt could object, turning it over in his hands with the fascinated attention of someone who'd found his story. This is exactly the kind of thing my readers want to hear about. Australian ingenuity in action, soldiers solving problems with local materials. Who came up with this? It's been done various ways by various units, Hewitt said, reclaiming his canteen. Hard to say who originated any particular field modification. Men share techniques, adapt what works. But Fletcher wasn't buying the vagueness. He'd clearly already talked to other soldiers, collected fragments of the real story. I heard there was a formal demonstration involving a Japanese prisoner. I heard casualty rates drop significantly in units using these wrapped canteens. That's not just field adaptation, Captain. That's tactical innovation that could be valuable to other theaters. Morris appeared in the tent entrance, as if summoned by the conversation's dangerous direction. Quote 167 Fletcher allowed himself to be redirected, but not before giving Hewitt a look that said this conversation wasn't finished. After they left, Hewitt sat in the tent, listening to the camp sounds around him. Generators running, men talking, the constant background buzz of insects. He was acutely aware that Fletcher's story, if written the wrong way, could expose the entire improvised network that had grown around the canteen solution. That evening, Carson called a meeting in the command tent. Present were Morris, Hewitt, Sergeant Holbrook, and Captain Reynolds, who'd apparently returned from Moresby for reasons nobody had explained. Carson stood at a field table covered with maps and reports, his expression giving away nothing. "Gentlemen," Carson began, "we have a problem that needs managing. Mr. Fletcher wants to write about Australian innovation in jungle warfare, which is normally something we'd encourage. However, his angle involves equipment modifications that were never officially authorized, and tactical countermeasures that don't appear in any approved doctrine." Reynolds spoke up, his voice carrying the bureaucratic precision Hewitt had come to recognize. If Fletcher publishes a story about wrapped canteens improving survival rates, several things happen. First, every unit in the theater will demand the modification, creating supply chain pressures we can't meet. Second, higher command will ask why this wasn't implemented systematically if it's so effective. Third, and most importantly, the Japanese will read the story and understand exactly why their acoustic tracking methods stopped working. The last point hung in the air. Hewitt hadn't fully considered it before, but Reynolds was right. The Japanese monitored Allied publications, looking for tactical intelligence. A story celebrating the canteen solution would tell them precisely what had changed, allowing them to adapt their methods. Quote 171 Morris said. Quote 172, quote 173, Carson replied. Quote 174, Holbrook, who'd been quiet until now, cleared his throat. What if we redirect him? Give him a different innovation story, something real but less tactically sensitive. The water purification improvements we implemented last month, maybe, or the modified field dressings that reduced infection rates. Carson nodded slowly. That could work, but Fletcher's already fixated on the canteens. We'd need to make him think pursuing that angle would be professionally damaging. Reynolds pulled out a folder, setting it on the table with deliberate care. I took the liberty of preparing documentation that reclassifies canteen modifications as experimental equipment under evaluation. Technically true, if we backdate some paperwork. Under military regulations, experimental equipment can't be discussed in public forums until testing is complete and results are reviewed. Fletcher publishes about it, he's violating operational security protocols. And his accreditation gets pulled, Morris said, understanding. He can't work as a war correspondent without credentials. Hewitt watched this bureaucratic choreography with a mixture of fascination and disgust. They were going to threaten Fletcher's career to protect a secret that was barely secret, that had spread through half the units in the sector through informal channels. The absurdity of it felt like a perfect crystallization of how the military operated. What couldn't be acknowledged officially could still be weaponized administratively. Carson assigned Morris to handle Fletcher, to explain the situation in terms that were friendly but unmistakable. The correspondent would get his story about Australian innovation, just not the story he'd thought he was writing. And Hewitt would remain in the background, his name absent from whatever narrative eventually emerged. Fletcher took the redirection badly. Hewitt watched from a distance as Morris walked him through the camp, gesturing at various improvements and modifications that were technically impressive, but emotionally flat. Fletcher's body language showed frustration, the slump of someone whose good story was being killed by bureaucracy. But he also knew when he was beaten. By evening, he'd shifted his focus to medical innovations, interviewing the camp doctor about improvised treatments for tropical diseases. 3 days later, Fletcher left for another camp, his notebook full of acceptable material. Before he went, he found Hewitt near the motor pool and handed him a business card with a Sydney address. Fletcher said, he paused, quote, 182. After Fletcher was gone, Hewitt burned the business card, watching the paper curl and blacken in a trash fire. The story would stay buried, or it would emerge decades later when nobody cared anymore, or it would transform into myth so completely that the truth became irrelevant. Any of those outcomes seemed equally likely. The wrapped canteens kept spreading. By the end of the month, Hewitt estimated that maybe 40% of the combat troops in the sector were using some version of the technique. The percentage varied by unit, with veteran companies showing higher adoption rates than fresh replacements who still trusted official equipment. Then the Japanese adapted. It started with small indicators, patrols taking fire in situations where they should have been acoustically invisible, casualties occurring in patterns that suggested the enemy had found new tracking methods. The first clear evidence came from a unit operating near Finschhafen, where a patrol with fully wrapped canteens walked into an ambush that killed 3 men before they could scatter. The survivors reported that the ambush had been perfectly positioned, suggesting advanced knowledge of their route and timing. No sound signature should have given them away, but somehow the Japanese had known exactly where they'd be. Hewitt read the after-action report with a sinking feeling, recognizing the beginning of a new cycle. Kila appeared at the camp perimeter one evening, the first time Hewitt had seen him in weeks. He carried no kapok this time, just himself and information that couldn't be trusted to intermediaries. Quote, 183 Kila, said without preamble. Quote, 184, quote, 185, Hewitt said. Quote, 186, quote, 187, Kila replied. Quote, 188. He looked at Hewitt with something like sympathy. Quote, 189. Kila's question stayed with Hewitt through the weeks that followed, a persistent ache that no amount of work could fully suppress. The wrapped canteens remained ubiquitous throughout the sector, so common now that new replacements received informal instruction during their first week in camp. The technique had achieved something close to institutional acceptance without ever becoming official doctrine, existing in the gap between what was written and what was practiced. But the tactical advantage had narrowed. Japanese patrols compensated for the loss of acoustic signatures by tightening their surveillance patterns, watching trails more carefully, studying the undergrowth for signs of recent passage. 3 more ambushes in October suggested they were learning to read the jungle's disruption rather than listening for man-made sounds. The killing continued, just distributed differently across the landscape. Morris brought Hewitt the latest casualty reports one morning, setting them on the workbench without comment. Hewitt scanned the numbers, doing the arithmetic he'd learned to do automatically. 16 men lost in the sector over 3 weeks, some to ambush, some to disease, 2 to a mortar barrage that had caught them in the open. The causes varied, but the result was constant. Bodies shipped back or buried in jungle graves, families receiving telegrams. We're still below the rates from before the canteens, Morris said, anticipating Hewitt's question. Hewitt set down the reports. Morris lit a cigarette, offering one to Hewitt. Hewitt repeated, tasting the word's inadequacy. Better than being blamed if something went wrong, or credited if something went right, because credit means responsibility, and responsibility means targets on backs. Morris exhaled smoke toward the tent ceiling. You wanted your brother's death to mean something. It does, just not in the way you imagined, not with your name on it. The end of October brought heavy rains that turned the camp into a maze of mud and standing water. Equipment rotted faster, men got sick more frequently, and the jungle seemed to press closer, reclaiming the space humans tried to carve from it. Patrols went out anyway, returning with reports of limited contact and deteriorating conditions. Private Chen found Hewitt during one of the downpours, water streaming off his poncho. He'd been keeping his unofficial statistics, updating his coded notebook with each patrol's results, building a database that existed nowhere in official records. "I need to show you something," Chen said, leading Hewitt to a supply tent where he'd set up a makeshift workspace. Papers covered a folding table, arranged in columns that tracked unit designations, mission types, casualty rates, equipment status. Chen had been doing actual statistical analysis, controlling for variables in ways that would have impressed a research scientist. Quote 199, Chen said, pointing to a chart he'd drawn by hand. "Units with wrapped canteens show reduced casualties across the board, but the reduction isn't constant. It's highest in sectors with dense vegetation, where sound carries but sight lines are limited. In more open terrain, the advantage disappears almost completely. And there's this," he pulled out another sheet. "Casualty rates for wrapped canteen units started improving in September, peaked in early October, and have been declining since. We're losing our edge." Hewitt studied the charts, seeing his obsession reduced to data points and trend lines. "The Japanese adapted faster than we expected. Or we're dealing with different Japanese units now. Or the wrapped canteens were never as effective as we thought, and September's numbers were statistical noise, or a dozen other explanations." Chen gathered the papers carefully, protecting them from the water dripping through the tent seams. "Point is, we can't prove what worked or why. We just have correlation and hope." That night, Hewitt lay in his cot listening to rain hammer the tent fabric, thinking about certainty and its absence. He'd built the canteen solution on a foundation of anger and grief, convinced that solving one specific problem would matter in some measurable way. But war resisted measurement, dissolved causality into probability, turned specific actions into statistical trends that might mean everything or nothing. Sergeant Vickers came to see him the next morning, arriving early before the camp fully woke. He carried his canteen, the one wrapped in kapok that had survived dozens of patrols. The wrapping showed its age now, fibers compressed and stained, wire bindings rusted but still holding. Quote, 205, Vickers said without preamble. Quote, 206. He set the canteen on Hewitt's workbench. "Wanted to return this before I left. Seems wrong to take it with me when other men still need it." Hewitt picked up the canteen, feeling its weight, the texture of degraded kapok under his fingers. "You could keep it, as a reminder." "Of what? That we wrapped metal in plant fiber and maybe it helped?" "Maybe it didn't. Maybe it just made us feel like we had some control over the randomness." Vickers' voice carried no bitterness, just exhaustion. Vickers turned to leave, then paused. After Vickers left, Hewitt unwrapped the canteen carefully, peeling away layers of kapok and wire that had served their purpose. The metal underneath showed wear patterns, small dents and scratches from months of use. He considered rewrapping it for someone else, but decided against it. Let it go back into general supply, become anonymous again. Major Carson issued new patrol guidelines in early November, emphasizing noise discipline across all equipment types. The directive never mentioned canteens specifically, but it recommended that units develop their own field modifications to reduce acoustic signatures. The language was careful, creating permission without acknowledgement, allowing practices to continue while maintaining official deniability. Hewitt recognized his work in the directive's DNA, his solution transformed into bureaucratic principle. No credit, no attribution. Just the slow absorption of improvisation into doctrine. He should have felt vindicated, but mostly felt tired. The wrapped canteens kept spreading to other sectors, carried by transferred personnel who taught the technique to new units. Reports filtered back through informal channels. Similar modifications appearing near Bougainville, in the Solomon Islands, anywhere Australian troops operated in jungle terrain. The method evolved as it spread, each unit adding variations, using different materials, adapting to local conditions. By December, the origin story had fragmented into multiple competing versions. Some said it came from American forces who'd learned it in training. Others claimed it was indigenous knowledge shared by New Guinea scouts. A few attributed it to captured Japanese equipment that had similar features. Hewitt's name appeared in none of these versions, and neither did David's. Chen showed Hewitt one final update to his statistics in mid-December, just before he rotated to a different assignment. Chen said, handing over a typed summary he'd produced on a borrowed typewriter, "Units using wrapped canteens showed approximately 17% reduction in patrol casualties when compared to baseline rates from July through September. Confidence interval is wide because of confounding variables, but the effect appears real and persistent." 17%, Hewitt said. The number felt simultaneously significant and inadequate. 17% of men who might have died but didn't. In our sector alone, that's maybe 30, 40 lives over 4 months. Multiply that across other units adopting the technique. Chen shrugged. It's not nothing, Captain, even if nobody knows you did it. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945, though Hewitt had already shipped back to Australia by then, reassigned to administrative duties in Brisbane that felt like exile disguised as reward. He spent the final months of the war reviewing supply requisitions and equipment reports, watching the bureaucratic machinery process the conflict into official narratives that bore little resemblance to what he remembered. He never received formal recognition for the canteen project. No commendation appeared in his service record, no mention in after-action reviews. The technique itself became so commonplace that by war's end nobody could say definitively where it originated. Field manuals published in late 45 included brief references to noise discipline and equipment modification, written in passive voice that attributed the innovations to nobody in particular. Hewitt returned to civilian life in September, taking a position at an insurance firm in Adelaide, where he processed claims and calculated risk in ways that felt absurdly clean compared to jungle warfare. His co-workers knew he'd served, but didn't ask for details, and he offered none. The war became something he'd done in the past, filed away with other experiences that didn't translate well to peacetime conversation. He kept one artifact from New Guinea, a canteen wrapped in kapok, not the one Vickers had returned, but a different one he'd made himself during the last week before deployment home. He never filled it with water, never used it for its intended purpose. It sat on a shelf in his study, gathering dust, a physical reminder of work that had mattered intensely for a brief period, and then evaporated into institutional memory. Morris wrote to him once, in 1946, a brief letter that arrived without return address. The letter mentioned that casualty statistics from their sector had been compiled into a lessons learned report circulating through military planning offices. The report noted improved survival rates in jungle operations, but attributed them to multiple factors: better training, improved intelligence, tactical adaptations by field commanders. The wrapped canteens were mentioned as one technique among many, given equal weight to better radio discipline and revised patrol protocols. "Your work saved lives," Morris wrote. "The exact number is unknowable and doesn't matter. What matters is that men who would have died came home instead. The military will never acknowledge your specific contribution, because acknowledging it would require admitting the original equipment was inadequate. But the men who survived know, even if they don't know your name." Hewitt read the letter twice, then filed it away in a drawer he rarely opened. He understood what Morris was offering, the consolation that anonymous effectiveness was still effectiveness, that impact didn't require attribution. Some days he believed it. Other days he thought about David's last letter, cheerful and ordinary, and felt the familiar weight of grief that no statistical analysis could quantify. In 1948, Hewitt married a woman named Elizabeth, who taught primary school and had no interest in war stories. They had 2 children, lived in a modest house with a garden, participated in the ordinary routines of post-war Australian life. He was, by any external measure, successful and well-adjusted. The war became something that had happened to a different version of himself, someone he could barely recognize in the mirror. Occasionally he would meet other veterans at social functions or community events, and they would exchange the careful pleasantries of men who'd seen things they preferred not to discuss. Sometimes these conversations would turn to jungle warfare, and someone would mention the wrapped canteens as a bit of field wisdom everyone had known. Hewitt would nod along, confirming the collective myth, never correcting the record. In 1952, A customer came into Hewitt's office carrying a battered canteen wrapped in what looked like kapok fiber, though age and use had degraded it almost beyond recognition. The customer was a farmer applying for property insurance, and the canteen sat on his desk amid the paperwork, unremarked and ordinary. Hewitt found himself staring at it, unable to focus on the insurance forms. Finally, he asked, "Where did you get that canteen?" The farmer glanced at it as if noticing it for the first time. "This old thing? Had it since the war. Served in New Guinea, learned to wrap them like this from other blokes in my unit. Kept the sound down, made it harder for Jap snipers to track you. Simple trick, but it worked. Never did find out who came up with it originally. Just something everyone did." "Just something everyone did," Hewitt repeated, signing the insurance application with hands that had once wrapped canteens in a jungle clearing half a world away. The farmer took his paperwork and left, the wrapped canteen going with him, another piece of anonymous history disappearing into the ordinary flow of civilian life. Hewitt sat in his office for a long time afterward, thinking about attribution and erasure, about the difference between what happened and what gets remembered. He never told Elizabeth about the canteens, never explained to his children why he kept that dusty artifact on his study shelf. It remained his private connection to David, to the men who'd survived, to the work that had consumed him for a brief period when grief and engineering had intersected in ways he could almost control. The story stayed buried, transformed into collective myth, preserved in the muscle memory of men who'd learned the technique without knowing its origin. Years later, military historians would occasionally note the widespread use of wrapped canteens in Pacific jungle operations, usually in footnotes discussing field modifications and soldier ingenuity. Some accounts would mention Australian innovation, others would attribute the technique to various units or individuals. None would mention Hewitt's name. None would mention David. The story had become what it needed to be: anonymous, practical, effective enough to survive without requiring heroes. Hewitt lived to 73, dying quietly in 1978 of heart failure. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly, listing him as a signals officer who'd served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. The wrapped canteen from his study shelf was donated to a local museum, where it sat in storage for decades, labeled simply as Field Modified Equipment, circa 1944, donor unknown. If you're interested in more stories about the hidden innovations and unrecorded sacrifices that shaped history, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. These forgotten corners of the past deserve to be remembered, even when the people who created them have been lost to time.